do not add very much to the plot, and there are no stereotypical quirks or accessories that are used to distract from their often blank and de-individualized representations. These characters all wear the same kinds of clothes as the white characters, have similar accessories, and speak with similar accents. But this form of pseudo equality is actually flattening and dehumanizing. In Red Dead 2, Charles, Lenny, and Tilly have no connection to any storyline or backstory that explains how racism has affected them. They are supposed to be representative of Black Americans at the turn of the 20th century, and yet there is no mention of the specific dangers these characters, these three Black characters, might face while moving around the various far-flung regions of the Western and Southern United States. These characters are robbed of the kind of context that makes Blackness coherent and evocative in a way that does not center the white male gaze. In Red Dead 2, there is no understanding or acknowledgement of the fact that Lenny, Tilly, and Charles might have a different experience of certain states and cities than the white members of the Vanderlyn gang. For instance, the Lemoyne Raiders are a fictional amalgamation of several Confederate paramilitary groups that existed around the turn of the century. And they are an important and violent antagonist of the Vanderlyn gang for a sizable chunk of the game. Yet even when the gang is set upon by members of the Lemoyne Raiders, none of the Black characters are singled out. So the racism championed by this group only exists in the abstract within the game world, because Charles, Tilly, and Lenny are not affected by it any more than the other characters. What characters like Charles, Tilly, and Lenny show us is that for Black characters in digital spaces to be truly legible as human requires a narrative that acknowledges the racist and dehumanizing context which helps to create these characters. As we see with the Lemoyne Raiders, it is not enough for a game like Red Dead 2 to have a racist militia and a few Black characters if there is no narrative understanding of what could happen if those two entities meet. As a result of there being no mention of how enslavement and other kinds of race-based violence has specifically affected Charles, Tilly, and Lenny in Red Dead 2, their digital Black bodies have been cut away from what amounts to a digital representation of the flesh, which then forestalls other attempts to give these Black characters any approximation of subjectivity. Horton Spillers describes the flesh as that 0 degree of social conceptualization that does not escape concealment under the brush of discourse or the reflexes of iconography. Whew. Spillers also goes on to say that if we think of the flesh as a primary narrative, then we mean its seared, divided, ripped apartness. As a primary narrative, one that tells the true story of the Black body in an American context, the flesh is the ultimate contextualization. Thus, by erasing the racialized context, the American grammar of the pre-symbolic, bruised, beaten, and violated Black body of Black characters like Charles, Tilly, and Lenny, in American-based video game worlds, there is no longer any possibility for those characters to represent the humanness of Blackness in a digital context. In the absence of any context necessary to make Blackness legible as human, it does seem that many video game creators expect the brown skin of their Black characters to do a large part of the work of contextualizing and filling out the existence of these characters. In Red Dead 2, the brown skin of the 3 Black characters in the Vanderlyn gang is supposed to tell players everything they need to know about them. Players have no information about where Tilly, Lenny, or Charles are from, or why and how they met Dutch and decided to join the gang. All players know is that they are Black characters, but that does not connote any information related to the game world. Spillers does make a mention of a relationship between the flesh and the skin, in which the skin becomes a kind of stand-in for the flesh. She writes, quote, the undecipherable markings on the captive body render a kind of hieroglyphics of the flesh, who severs disjuncture come to be hidden to the cultural seeing by skin color. Accordingly, Michelle Stevens argues that, quote, the skin in a Black context has become in modern times a master signifier for the specificity, the particularity of race. It is the object by what Frantz Fanon and Paul Gilroy call epidermalization. It is the sign for race, understood purely as scopic sight, unquote. But in Red Dead 2, there is no specificity of race. There is no American captive body, as that captive body can only be located in Guarma in the game world. Guarma is a tropical island that some characters are shipwrecked on. With no racializing context, the representational power of the skin to represent both the body and the flesh of the American Black character is non-existent. With no information from within the game to situate Black characters as meaningful subjects created by the world that surround them, players have to rely on information from outside of the game to make sense of characters like Charles, Lenny, and Tilly. And the decontextualization of these characters makes them nothing more than an animated picture of a human. Part of why video games have to rely on contextualization so much to create a kind of subjectivity for their characters is because digital Black bodies are always already within the symbolic order. As Stevens argues, the flesh, quote, represents the body that sits on the very edge, on the underside of the symbolic order, pre-symbolic and pre-linguistic, just before words have meaning. It has yet to be sealed away into an image or bodily ideal, end quote. Video game versions of Black bodies are both images and a kind of bodily ideal from the point of creation. There is no point at which Black characters and their bodies within video games can be pre-symbolic. So without context, they are abandoned to the symbolic order, but only as it is viewed from above by the white male gaze. Without another modality of viewing these Black characters, they become nothing more than icons that are simultaneously empty of internal substance, but heavily laden with whatever discourses help to situate the Black body as other, marginal, or inhuman. Thus, regardless of whether video game creators overburden Black characters with stereotypical clothing and accessories or not, representations of the Black body in digital spaces remains unreadable in very conscientious ways. Yeah, okay. Video game producers have yet to truly reckon with the complicated nature of portraying the Black body in digital spaces, partly because its existence in the symbolic order dislocates this same body from a specific time or any particular space. The character of Blackness that is most popular in American media can be placed in any time period and in any fashion necessary for whichever American origin story is being repackaged. Black characters with no subjectivity, with no true context, are as common in American media as the Western and the cowboy. And the flesh is a primary narrative that the American media can never let be a part of the American origin story. Thus, video games that separate Black characters from the primary narrative of the flesh do so in service to an American national imaginary that continues on all levels to repeat the ripping and tearing apart of the flesh from the Black body. So this is kind of the conclusion, kind of rounding things up here. If nothing else, I hope this paper makes clear that true equity in gaming will be difficult until there's equity in American media more broadly. It is clear digital spaces will not be exempt from the American imaginary. No discursive space is. If players and creators alike seek to define humanness in ways that can be digitized, both are undertaking a complicated problem with an uncertain end. As we make our machines more like us, more human, we replicate the hierarchies of humanness at play in the physical world. In terms of the video games that have been created thus far, we are not at our best in the stories we tell. We are at our worst. As creators and players of video games and willing consumers in the burgeoning video game market, when we allow the dehumanization of minorities and women in the versions of American history we tell ourselves, we accept that dehumanization will be attached to American futures as well. I know one critique for my argument in this paper will be that it is not the job of video game creators to faithfully and voraciously represent historical time periods and historical people. I think that's a cop-out. I'm just gonna go ahead and say that to the camera. I think that's a cop-out. In Red Dead 2, players not only have the ability, but are encouraged to collect 144 individual cigarette cards, 30 collectible dinosaur bones, 40 different period-specific hats, 19 breeds of horses at various levels, and hundreds of other collectibles and accessories. There are also bounties on game characters based on actual historical outlaws. There is a hidden serial killer mystery, and there are 5 states worth of landscape and non-playable characters. Everything in Red Dead 2 is meant to display a historical tether to reality, and Black characters are owed that same careful consideration. In fact, one of the most interesting critiques of Red Dead 2, as I mentioned before, that it is too realistic. So realistic, in fact, that this realism impedes on the game player experience. The only element of play in which that is not the case is in the portrayal of characters that are Black, Indigenous, and female. Thank you very much. I guess we'll take questions now.
Are we able to just ask questions at any time? I didn't want to disrupt the flow of things.
Yes.
Hi. Awesome. Professor Hamilton, that was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much for your work and for that. Can you just give us a little bit of background? We often get questions about, why does this stuff matter? Why should we care about Blackness as it relates to video games? Why? I think that's an important question to help us answer and make sense of things, especially at this particular moment that we're in.
That's a great question. And that, that makes me think of some of Sylvia Winter's work, which I delved into a little bit in the section that I cut out for this talk. How we understand who and what is human is part, ontological, part biological, but it's also part narrative. And the narratives that we tell ourselves and each other about who we are, who is human, and what is American even really, really matter. And I think that we don't realize often that that the kind of media we consume and the stories that get told over and over again have a goal. And that goal is to situate all of us in particular versions of Americanness. And if we continue to sort of excise and carve out people of color, women, all these various identities and intersections out of what we think of as Americanness, then we're going to have a problem, and we're going to continue having the same problems that we have with American culture and American society. More questions?
I've got tons more. Now listen, I'm geeking out over here. So while other people are gathering their thoughts, I'm just going to keep talking to you, if that's okay, Professor Hamilton.
Fine with me.
So you talked about Red Dead Redemption, and I'm guessing that there is not that much to be said about Blackness in Red Dead Redemption, or is there tons that could be said about Blackness in Red Dead Redemption? I think, I'm no historian, but I remember, there are some folks, uncovering, going into the crates in the archives, and putting Black folks back into that conversation on Westernness and, the frontier. Does Red Dead Redemption do some of that, putting Black folks back into these conversations?
No, it doesn't do any of that, which is what the first part of the paper is about, right? This is about, so the video game is set in 1899, and this is about a sort of gang of outlaws who are hitting middle age and who can see that the way that they live their lives, this outlaw life, it's coming to an end, right? Civilization and trains and robber barons and lots of money, all these things are flowing westward. And so because of, a failure at some heist, they are being forced eastward and south as well. And so, as you move through the South on your very nice horse, or rather a crappy horse, depending on your luck, you don't see any Black non-playable characters, no NPCs, right? The only